largest of arteries, the aorta, and then the first couple generations of branches coming off. So we can assume the first generation of branches, they're still large arteries, but after that we're getting into medium and then small. All right, so now this is what I've referred to a few times. This is what the aorta can do because it's so elastic. It can expand and absorb a large volume of blood and then recoil to move that blood downstream. So the ventricle is contracting, semilunar valve is open. Let's say stroke volume is 75 mils. As that 75 mils enters the aorta, not all of it can go through the aorta downstream to the capillaries because of resistance. It's coming in faster than it can pass through. So what happens is a proportion of it passes through, 25 mils, but the rest of it just expands the aorta, the other 50 mils. So from that stroke volume of 75 mils, 50 was absorbed by the aorta, so to speak. The other 25 went through the aorta downstream. Then the semilunar valve closes. We're now in diastole. There's no more blood entering the aorta, so the pressure begins to fall. And as the pressure falls, the elastic fibers can now recoil. Right? And they recoil, and that basically squeezes the blood that's inside of the aorta and pushes it downstream. And the timing is perfect. It's not a coincidence that 25 is 1/3 of 75 and 50 is 2/3 of 75. How much time does the heart spend in systole, ejecting blood? About 1/3 of the cardiac cycle. So during the first third of the cardiac cycle, we move 1/3 of the stroke volume through the aorta downstream. The remaining 2/3 of the cardiac cycle, the heart's in systole, right? Semilunar valve is closed. Well, that's when we move the other 2/3 of the stroke volume downstream. In the end, there's constant blood flow downstream from the aorta to the capillaries at all times. What would happen, what would be different if the aorta and the arteries in general were rigid tubes? If they could not stretch and recoil?
They would rupture.
You would have intermittent blood flow. So blood would only be flowing through the arteries and towards the capillaries during systole. But then when the valve closes and blood stops entering the aorta, blood would stop flowing downstream. You've lost your pressure. Why is there still pressure during diastole? The recoil of the aorta. That's creating the pressure to keep blood moving downstream. So you're taking kinetic energy as blood is ejected into the aorta, and you're using it to stretch the walls. And now in that stretched, expanded position, you have potential energy. Right? And then during diastole, we're going to use that potential energy, convert it back to kinetic energy as the elastic fibers recoil, and push that blood downstream. So now the aorta is the pump, so to speak. The recoil of the aorta is acting as the pump.
I thought the aorta doesn't expand.
Expands a ton. That's why it needs to be so elastic, so it can do that. And that's what veins can't do as well as arteries, because they don't have the same amount of elastic tissue. They're not good at stretching and recoiling. Stretching and distending are two different things. You could have zero elastic tissue in a vein, but as long as the wall is thin enough, you can still distend the vein, right? But what can't it do after you distend it?
Recoil.
No recoil. You have to rely purely on smooth muscle contracting to get you back down to that original diameter. Now, it's not that veins have zero elastic tissue. They just have very little compared to arteries. So not there yet, so we'll just leave it here. Medium and small arteries. Nicknames: muscular, distributing. Muscular is an anatomical nickname. Distributing is a functional nickname. Why are they called muscular arteries? proportionately, they have the greatest percentage of smooth muscle. By far, their thickest layer is tunica media. So most of the thickness of the wall is muscle, hence muscular artery. And now we're going to use this muscle. We don't really use the smooth muscle of the large arteries. For the most part, they don't constrict, they don't dilate. Stretch and recoil, yes, but that's different. The smooth muscle is largely inactive in the large artery, but muscular arteries, we're going to use it. We're going to use it to constrict and dilate and decide just how much blood is going to flow through this vessel into a particular organ or tissue. What's happening to the muscular arteries that serve the lower limb muscles when you're jogging? Are they dilating or constricting? They're dilating, right? Because those exercising muscles are going to need a lot more blood flow, right? To get more blood to flow into those capillaries of those exercising muscles, you got to dilate those muscular arteries. And that's also why they are called distributing arteries. We use the muscle to distribute blood by constricting and dilating the vessel. During exercise, you have to redistribute all your blood flow. You only have 5 liters to work with. That is your blood volume. So if skeletal muscles need 10 times more blood flow during exercise, which they tend to, compared to rest, well, other organs are going to have to sacrifice. They're going to have to receive less blood flow. Like the kidneys, digestive system organs. They're going to get less, so that other tissues, cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle can get more. An example of a medium artery, external carotid. External carotid is a branch off of what? Common carotid. And when you see the word common before the name of the vessel, that tells you that it's going to split, it's going to branch. All right, so the common carotid is going to branch into an external and internal carotid. The left common carotid comes off of what? The aorta. Right? So left common carotid is the first generation branch, still considering that to be a large artery. Next generation branch, external or internal, that would be more medium-sized, muscular artery. What's controlling the smooth muscle to promote constriction or dilation? Sympathetic nervous system and hormones. What are some hormones that are vasoconstrictors besides epinorepinephrine? Ang2, ADH, also known as vasopressin. Next is arterioles. Their nickname, resistance vessels. Why are they called the resistance vessels? Because they have the smallest diameter. And this is where we see the biggest change in diameter as you transition from small arteries to arterioles. There's a dramatic drop in diameter and therefore a dramatic increase in resistance. We can manipulate the resistance of the arterioles to further direct blood flow. So we start with dilating and constricting the muscular arteries. All right, so let's say we want to increase blood flow in general to a particular organ. But then within that organ, we want more blood to go to the tissue at the top versus the tissue at the bottom. So we can use branches off of the small arteries, like arterioles, to fine-tune just how much blood is going to flow to different parts of that organ. So the muscular just gets more blood flowing towards the organ. And then once we sort of get within the organ, we can use the smaller branches, like arterioles, to fine-tune. And what controls the smooth muscle of the arterioles? Sympathetic nervous system, hormones. But in addition to that, local environment. chemicals within the tissue, like the amount of oxygen, the amount of CO2, the amount of lactic acid, the amount of potassium. So the chemical concentration within that tissue is going to have an effect on the smooth muscle of those arterioles. So that's going to provide local control. As you'll see later, we'll get into all this, all the details. If CO2 is climbing and O2 is falling, right around the capillary bed within this tissue, that's a sign that the tissue, the capillary bed, is not receiving adequate blood flow. The cells are using oxygen faster than they're getting it. They're producing CO2 faster than it's being removed, so O2 falls, CO2 climbs. What do you think that's going to do to the smooth muscle of the arterioles? Cause them to contract so that the arteriole constricts, or relax so it dilates? Relax and dilate. Because what caused the O2 to be low and the CO2 to be high? Lack of blood flow. How do you fix that? Increase blood flow by dilating the vessel. So without any influence from hormones or sympathetic nervous system, within tissues, the local environment will affect the radius of the blood vessel, whether it's constricting or dilating. So that's intrinsic control. Sympathetic hormones, that's extrinsic. Arterioles are affected by both. Okay, but the muscular arteries, just extrinsic. No influence by local environment. Because we're not in the tissue yet. We're getting there. We're getting close to it. Disorders of arterial vessels. A closer look. So check out pages 700 to 701. This is all stuff we've talked about. So I think I'll just skip over it for now. So check out slides 13 through 17. Got some pictures of some really gunked up arteries. This is common carotid. It's going to split into internal and external, and this is all plaque in here. Very gunked up. Same thing here. Plaque formation, inflammation. This one's really bad. We've almost lost all luminal diameter. You're down to a very, very small lumen that blood can pass through. Looks like it's been reduced to maybe 10%. Almost completely clogged up. And then there's some animations, and you can find tons of videos on YouTube. One that shows a balloon angioplasty with a stent left behind. One where we clean out with the atherectomy, and a coronary bypass. I haven't checked these links since last year, so if they're not good, just go to YouTube and type in the same keyword, like atherectomy, and you'll find tons.
What kind of imaging can they use to see if they're clogged up?
Dyes.
Dyes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But just to see how much it's clogged up. Can
Yeah.
they see that too?
Oh, yeah. Do you remember we had the pictures from chapter 18 slides?
Yeah,
where
but
we could
that
see
one
lots
never-
of blood and constricted, and then.
Yeah, it was just completely blocked, but to see if it's like 10%, it's still going through.
Oh, I don't think they were completely blocked. I think it was like 10%.
Huh.
I think there was a tiny bit of color there, right, where it was constricted.
Okay, gotcha.
I think it would be rare to have a complete blockage from atherosclerosis. Now, an embolism, sure, but these aren't emboli. This is atherosclerotic plaques. Here's the guide wire with the balloon. The balloon would be deflated at first, and once you get the guide wire in position where the plaque is, then you inflate the balloon. You prop open the vessel, and typically leave a stent behind. Keep it propped open. Percutaneous angioplasty, because they're actually going through the skin, and they usually do it in the thigh. And here's the contrast, the dye again. It's not completely occluded. It's probably like 10%. And then here's restoration of normal flow. So here's where they put the guide wire through a very superficial vein in the thigh. So it's minimally invasive. And then from there, they're going to guide it all the way backwards to the heart through the heart and into the coronary circulation. They've got a little camera on there, so they just keep running it through and watching where it goes. So I'm sure you can find tons of cool YouTube videos on this.
On that image you just skipped, it showed like it's bulging now. Would that create any weakness in the vessel?
No.
No.
As long as the vessel wall itself isn't damaged, it's not going to create an aneurysm.
Okay.
Capillaries. 3 general types: continuous, fenestrated, sinusoidal. Sinusoidal are also called sinuses, sinusoids, discontinuous capillaries. Think back to chapter 20, lymphatic system, spleen. After blood goes through the trabecular arteries, then goes through arterioles and the white pulp, and then capillaries, and then what was next? Sinuses of the red pulp. Well, what are those sinuses? Sinusoidal capillaries. Compared to the capillaries simply called capillaries, which are continuous, that's the standard, typical type of capillary in the body, the most abundant, the most common, continuous. In contrast to that, the one called medullary sinuses, those are much larger, much more permeable capillaries. But they're still just capillaries. That's not the same as dural sinuses. Dural sinuses are huge, right? You don't need a microscope to see those. So those aren't a type of capillary. What are they? A type of what? Really a type of vein. Right? Because by definition, what's a vein? A vessel that conducts blood flow back to the heart. And that's what the sinuses are doing, the dural sinuses. They're acting as veins. But what we're calling sinusoidal capillaries, or even the medullary sinuses of the spleen, that's microscopic. Those are capillaries. These are all over the place, including skin and muscle. They're the least permeable. Okay? They're the typical capillary we've been talking about. Cells don't get through. Plasma proteins don't get through. You know, the occasional super small plasma protein might sneak across, but for the most part, cells, proteins don't get through. Everything smaller than proteins does. The gases, the nutrients, the wastes, all the stuff we need to exchange at the capillary. Fenestrated, more permeable than continuous. Big enough pores in the cells, or big enough gaps between the cells, or a combination of the two, to move not only non-protein solutes, but proteins. Cells still aren't getting through, but plasma proteins can get through. We find these in the small intestines, the kidneys, endocrine glands. Why endocrine glands? Why does that make sense?
Hormones.
Big proteins that carry the hormones.
Most hormones are proteins, and we need to get those protein hormones into the blood. Now, one way to do that across a continuous capillary is transcytosis. So if a hormone is leaving the bloodstream and affecting muscle, for example, well, then, yeah, it's going to have to cross the endothelial cell by transcytosis. That's how we move growth hormone. That's how we move insulin. But when we're actually putting these hormones into the bloodstream, we can do it much more efficiently because transcytosis costs ATP. A more efficient way is just to have bigger gaps between endothelial cells or big pores through them so that the protein hormone can just go through by diffusion. So that's how we tend to put protein hormones into the bloodstream, by using modified capillaries in those endocrine tissues, fenestrated capillaries.
Aren't they some carriers, proteins that they carry the hormones?
But the hormone, the lipophilic hormone, could go right through the endothelial cell, right? It doesn't need a pore because it's lipophilic. And then it would bind to the protein in the capillary.
It will be detached from the protein inside of the capillary and then diffuses?
Yes.
Okay. So it doesn't-
Because remember,
the
lipophilic
interstitial-
hormones can only bind to receptors when they're free. They have to leave the carrier. So the carrier will stay in the blood, and the hormone will detach and leave. The reason they're found in the small intestine and kidney, as well as endocrine glands, it just increases the efficiency, the speed of absorption and filtration. You can move more material across the capillary wall if it's more permeable. Okay, even if we're just moving glucose, glucose can fit through these gaps. Glucose can fit through these gaps. But we can move glucose across the capillary wall at a higher rate here. More permeable. Sinusoidal capillaries. The gaps between cells are so big, the pores running through the cells are so big, that not only can plasma proteins get through, but even cells, like red blood cells. So it would make sense that you find sinusoidal capillaries in bone, in spleen, medullary sinuses of the spleen, and in the liver. What do all three of these have in common? They're all locations where what happens?
They make these red blood cells and.
Where red blood cells are removed from circulation, right, and digested by macrophages. So we have to be able to move those red blood cells out of the blood, across the capillary wall, so that the macrophage can digest it and recycle the components. Bone marrow. It's not only a location where we pull red blood cells out, it's also the location where we put them in.
Removed from circulation.
Reticulocytes have to cross the capillary wall. They can't do that across the fenestrated or continuous capillary. They're not permeable enough.
Liver, bone marrow, spleen.
Okay, so let's start with the most permeable, the sinusoidal capillary. What can get through?
Red blood cells.
Everything. Cells, plasma proteins, and all the non-protein solutes, and of course water. How about fenestrated? What doesn't get through fenestrated that does get through sinusoidal? Cells.
Good question.
But the proteins can still get through, but not the cells. Continuous capillary. Now we're filtering out or restricting cells and proteins. So now only the non-protein solutes and water can get across. So remember, continuous are everywhere. Fenestrated and sinusoidal are in very specific locations. And they're in locations that typically require the movement of cells or proteins across the capillary wall.
Does diaphoresis happen at all of these? or-
Yes, but it's going to be faster and more efficient where you have the bigger gaps between endothelial cells. So it'd be much easier for white blood cells to get across the sinusoidal capillary than a continuous, but they can get through any. Capillary bed. So we're now at the microscopic level. We have an arteriole that brings blood into the capillary bed. We have a venule that drains blood out of the capillary bed. So microcirculation is an arteriole, a capillary bed, a venule. Notice that we have smooth muscle wrapped around the beginning of each true capillary. The whole thing is a capillary bed. One piece is a capillary. So you have a bunch of capillaries, a bunch of these really short, somewhat straight vessels, all connected into this big web or big network. Okay, so dozens, at least dozens of true capillaries are connected into a capillary bed or plexus. Coming off of the meta-arteriole, so you have your arteriole here. The next branch is a meta-arteriole. Blood leaving the meta-arteriole goes into capillaries connected to the meta-arteriole. And at the beginning of each of those capillaries, a sphincter. we use these sphincters to fine-tune even further just how much blood is going to go through this capillary bed. So where do we start making adjustments to how much blood is going to flow through a particular tissue or organ?
Arterial.
Back at the muscular arteries.
Oh.
That's when we start manipulating the smooth muscle, constricting, dilating. And then from there, we can further fine-tune at the arterioles. Once the blood goes through the arteriole, we can fine-tune yet again within the capillary bed, right? By relaxing or contracting these precapillary sphincters. So we can perfuse half the capillary bed, none of it, the whole thing. Depends on what the tissue needs. If you were to contract all of those precapillary sphincters, no blood would go through the capillary bed. By that I mean the true capillaries. Instead, you would shunt it across. This would create a shunt, a bridge, a pathway going straight from the arteriole to the venule. If the metabolic demands of this tissue are really, really low, maybe that's why we would do that. If the metabolic demands are really, really high, completely relax those sphincters and provide that tissue with maximal perfusion. Now this is probably unlikely unless we have other capillary beds that are also serving the same tissue, and we just don't need to use all of them. I would say on average we're somewhere between the two. Somewhere between no perfusion and full perfusion.
Is that what happens during exercise, where we eliminate blood to the intestines for closing those sphincters?
All three levels. We start constricting the muscular arteries, the arterioles, all the way down to the precapillary sphincters. We don't want to cut flow off completely. We don't want zero flow to those tissues. We just want the bare minimum to keep the cells alive. But we're not worried about processing nutrients, right? We shouldn't be digesting and absorbing right now. So when we're doing that, we need a lot more blood to flow through to those intestines to get all those nutrients.
And digestion occur. Say like
Can it? Sure. But what happens when you eat a large meal and then you try to exercise? It's a conflict of interest, and your body usually doesn't feel too good as a consequence. The muscles are trying to get the blood flow they need. The intestines are trying to get the blood flow they need. Nobody feels good. You feel nauseous. You get cramping in the muscles. Nobody's really getting what they need at that point.
Kind of topic, when you eat, what's like a good amount of time to wait before like exercising to like able to digest?
Depends on what and how much, right? So if it's something really light, piece of toast, half a banana, like 20 minutes. You just ate a meal, probably an hour, hour and a half.
That's generally how long it takes to digest.
Not everything, but enough.
Enough, so that's not interfering.
Yeah. I could see, having a Thanksgiving feast and having to wait like 3 or 4 hours before
day?
you could possibly do anything.
Yeah.
3 days.
Depends on quantity for sure.
Mentally, you feel like
Any sort of
It was like
activity.
2-3 hours at pace.
The danger with swimming is if you start cramping up and you're out in the lake and you're far from shore, that could be a problem. But as far as what's happening to the body, it wouldn't matter if you're swimming or jogging or anything else.
So if you're working out and for like extended period of time and you're hungry, you still want to eat, or like you felt like low energy?
That happens to me because I eat all the time, as you guys know. And I even eat while I'm exercising, but I keep it very light.
So would an energy drink be better than an actual like energy bar?
It would be better for it to be liquid, less processing involved, quicker, easier absorption. So yes, it would be better to do like goo or Gatorade over like a power bar. But if you're just taking little bits at a time, it shouldn't be a problem, right? It's just such a small quantity. But I nibble while I'm exercising on something light, so I get hungry before I'm done.
your body can't digest.
All right, one more thing, and then we'll move on to models. Capillary exchange. Capillaries are ideal for exchange One, because they're extremely thin. The wall of the capillary is just tunica interna with minimal connective tissue. Okay? You have the endothelium, and you have variable amounts of connective tissue around it, but very minimal. Short diameter. That's going to affect diffusion distance. So for an oxygen molecule in the middle of the blood, in the middle of the capillary, it doesn't have to diffuse very far to cross that capillary wall. Very small diameter, very short diffusion distance. Easy to get oxygen out and CO2 in when we're in the systemic capillaries. And of course the opposite in the pulmonary capillaries, O2 in, CO2 out. Huge surface area. And a huge surface area combined with a very low velocity. With more surface area, we can carry out more exchange, more diffusion, move more stuff in and out of the tissue. Right? So we'll come back to diffusion later, but one of the factors that determines diffusion is surface area. And the rule of thumb is the bigger the surface area, the higher the rate of diffusion, so more exchange. And then the benefit of the low velocity, time for those exchanges to take place, because diffusion takes some time. We don't want the blood rushing through the capillary so fast that oxygen doesn't have a chance to get out and CO2 doesn't have a chance to get in. We want plenty of time for exchange. Extensive branching not only gives us that huge surface area, but it tends to mean that, on average, just about every cell in the body is within a millimeter from a capillary. Almost every cell is right next to the blood supply. Now that being said, remember there are some tissues that are avascular. Right? So this isn't true for all cells. Cartilage is avascular. Epithelia is avascular. But what does epithelia have right underneath it?
Areola.
To provide nourishment. Areolar connective tissue that is very vascular. But you start getting into the epidermis, into those mid to superficial layers of keratinocytes, you're too far away from the capillaries down below in the areolar connective tissue, and that's why those keratinocytes die. Right? All the skin cells on the surface are all dead cells. They don't have to be alive to do their job, so it works out just fine. Okay, so next time we'll pick it up with capillary dynamics.
Okay. Capillary dynamics.
So grab your lists and
Thanks,
keep
Darcy,
working
yeah.
on the models.